these are the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclone Dots, one of the most popular dot skates on the market right now, and a skate I've been trying to cover here on the channel for quite a while. These skates are supposedly supposed to perform very similarly to the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Dots, and seeing as those are my current favorite skate, I'm very interested to see how these Cyclones stack up against X-Ray Pad's offerings and the other dot skates on the market. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to talk all about the pros and the cons of the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclones, and see if these skates are good enough to dethrone the X-Ray Pad Obsidian skates. But before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you to Potent Gaming, who was kind enough to send over these Cyclone skates for review. They also sent over a set of the Vortex and 66 dots for me to review as well, so if you're interested in learning more about GHOSTGLIDE's more unique skate offerings, be sure to get subscribed. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. In terms of pricing, each set of the Cyclone Dots retails for $20 Canadian, which is around $15 USD. The skates come in an envelope packaging similar in style to the old X-Ray Pad packaging we saw for the original Jaded Obsidian Dots, but the GHOSTGLIDES packaging here is much more premium feeling. Included with each set of the Cyclones is 40 dot skates, which do have a protective film installed on them out of the package, which is a great attention to detail. Also included is a single alcohol wipe and a little welcome card with a QR code that links to GHOSTGLIDE's Discord. On the back of the packaging, there is a little blip here that does give you some installation instructions, but personally speaking, I think X-Ray Pad has done a better job with this, as their packaging has little pictures as well as a more thorough explanation of how to install the skates compared to the instructions here on the GHOSTGLIDES skates. I would love to see GHOSTGLIDES use the back of their little welcome card here that is currently completely blank to have a more in-depth installation guide here instead of just this little blip on the back of the packaging, as it'll be easier for customers to understand the process with some pictures to guide them, as well as just an easier to read format. Speaking of the installation process, let's talk about that next. The installation process for the Cyclone Dots is the same process that you use for any dot skate. Simply remove your existing skates entirely. If you do have full-size stock skates installed, make sure you remove both layers if they happen to be a dual layered skate design. Next up, use the included alcohol wipe to clean the skate cutouts and remove any leftover adhesive residue from the old skates. Let the alcohol evaporate away, and then you can go ahead and install your Cyclone Dots. Now, personally speaking, for smaller mice like the HitScan Hyperlight, for example, I use only 6 dot skates, and for larger mice like the WiseOwl OGM Cloud V2, I use around 10. However, the number of dot skates you use is entirely up to personal preference. Just keep in mind that the less dots you use, the faster the mouse is going to feel, and conversely, the more dots you use, the more controlled the mouse is going to feel. Just be careful not to use too many dot skates, as the more you use, the more diminishing returns you'll get in terms of performance. Because of this, I personally recommend sticking within the 6 to 12 dot range, but play around and experiment and find whatever works best for your aim. But whatever number of dots you end up using, just make sure that the dots are positioned evenly and that you have the same number of dots on the top and bottom of the mouse. In terms of skate shaping, the Cyclones have the same cylindrical shape with a concave base and a slightly rounded convex top that we saw in the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Dots, but the Cyclones are slightly thinner and taller than the Obsidians, measuring 6mm wide and 0.9mm tall. Since these skates are smaller than X-Ray Pad's offerings, and X-Ray Pad's offerings were universal in terms of their mouse compatibility, the same goes here for the Cyclones, as they'll be usable with pretty much every mouse on the market. The Cyclone skates also have the same material makeup as the Obsidian Dots, being made out of hardened PTFE. This not only makes the Cyclones more controlled than traditional 100% PTFE skates, it also makes them much more durable. So the Cyclones will have a much longer lifespan when used on both soft and hard pads than 100% PTFE skates will. Now, the Cyclones themselves don't have any texturing to them and have a surfacing similar to the surfacing we saw in the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Dots, being a non-textured polished surface. The Cyclones also don't have any added SMPF foam layering like what we saw in the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air skates, but seeing as the skates have a very concave base and that they're made out of hardened PTFE, they'll be a quieter skate, but I'll talk more about the audio feedback later on in this video. GHOSTGLIDE is advertising that the Cyclones deliver a smooth and durable experience on both cloth and glass surfaces. However, they advertise that the skates are best suited only for hard and glass-based mouse pads. From my testing, the Cyclones are fantastic for both fabric and hard pads, but due to their dot skate nature, they're not usable on very soft fabric pads like the Infinity Mice Ruin, for example, as the dots are too small in their surface area and too short to counteract the depth of those pads, hence why GHOSTGLIDES is advertising the Cyclones as being best for glass pads and hard fabric pads. So as advertised, the Cyclones are best suited for medium to hard firmness pads like the Focus Ambition, Coruscant Samurai, and LGG Saturn Pro Firm. To be clear though, this isn't unique to the Cyclones, as every single dot skate on the market has the same compatibility issues with very soft fabric pads, so this issue isn't exclusive to Ghost Glide skates. In terms of pad type compatibility, the Cyclones are usable on all fabric pad types, whether it was speed, hybrid, or control. The skates perform very well across the board and maintained their balanced control performance profile. Of course, the skates will feel faster or slower depending on the pad you use them on, but they still felt fantastic across the board from my testing. Now, due to the Cyclone's hardened PTFE material, just like the XTRAPAD Obsidian skates, they do have a slight working period when they're used on hard pads such as glass, but you can easily work them in by pressing down on your mouse and quickly making large figure 8 shapes for approximately 20 to 30 seconds to fully work in the Cyclones. You can of course use them without working them in, but as with all skates that have working periods, it's best to work them in before you use them for gaming, but this only applies to hard pad usage. You don't need to work in the Cyclones on any kind of fabric pad. Now, given that the Cyclones are so similar to the XTRAPAD Obsidian dots, only some small differences in terms of their curvature and sizing, unsurprisingly the Cyclones perform very similarly to the Obsidians. Over my testing, the Cyclones performed as advertised and gave a very smooth experience across all pad types. I'd best describe the skates as a balanced control skate, same as I described the Obsidians, as they feel consistent in terms of their initial static and braking friction across all pad types, but due to their hardened PTFE nature, they're a little on the slower side. The Cyclones were also fantastic for use on glass, particularly on the lock-on Harut, but they're also fantastic on other hard pads like the Kazemi, Serapadkin, and Skypad 3.0. From my testing, the only real tangible difference between the Cyclones and the Obsidian skates, in my opinion, aside from their slight dimensional differences, is that the Cyclones are ever so slightly better on glass than the Obsidians are, and the Obsidians are ever so slightly better on fabric pads than the Cyclones are, but the difference between the two skates' performance is extremely slight, and the only reason I even notice this difference is because I have both the skates sitting right in front of me. Since the Cyclones are so balanced in terms of their performance, and as I mentioned earlier that they're usable on both speed, hybrid, and control fabric pads, and of course all glass pads, the Cyclones, just like the XTRAPAD Obsidians, are very universal in terms of their aim compatibility, but due to their hardened PTFE nature, the Cyclones are a little more controlled than what you'd find on 100% PTFE dots like the XTRAPAD Jade dots. Because of this, when you use the Cyclones on speed, hybrid, or control fabric pads, the Cyclones feel the best for more static and flicking aiming. They are usable for more dynamic and tracking aiming, but due to their slightly controlled nature, they might feel a little slow for some people. On hard pads such as glass pads like the lock-on Harut, the Cyclones felt their best in my opinion, as they're great for static and flicking, but they're also very good for dynamic and tracking aiming. Just keep in mind that the hard pads performance profile will of course affect the feeling of the Cyclones, just like what happened with the different types of fabric pads. And in terms of skate reusability, the Cyclones are using a very similar adhesive to the one that was used on the Obsidians. I assume it's some iteration of a 3M adhesive, but regardless of the adhesive type, the Cyclones also share the same fantastic reusability as the Obsidians, which is fantastic to see. They're not as easy to remove as the Obsidian Air series skates are, but they're still very reusable, and over my testing I didn't have any issues with the adhesive peeling away from the skate itself or giving out when moving the Cyclones from mouse to mouse. And lastly, I wanted to quickly talk about audio feedback. Interestingly enough, even though the Obsidian skates and the Cyclones share almost the exact same physical dimensions and of course the same material composition, the level of audio feedback between the skates is slightly different. This is because due to the Cyclone's more concave base, the skate doesn't make as much contact with the base of your mouse as the Obsidians do, and this results in slightly less friction being transferred from the skates into the mouse's frame, regarding a slight difference in the overall audio feedback you'll hear here on the Cyclone. To better illustrate the difference between the audio feedbacks here, let's compare the Cyclones against the Obsidian dots and the Obsidian Air dots on the lock-on Harut, the Beast, the Skypad 3.0, and the Serapadkin. As you just heard, the Cyclones kind of feel like a middle ground between the Obsidian Air and non-Air Obsidian skates in terms of their audio feedback. Of course, they're not as quiet as the Obsidian Air series skates, and I would love to see Ghost Glides add a layer of SMPF foam to the Cyclones to make them even quieter, but in their current state, they're still very quiet, which is very impressive. Alright, well, in closing, overall, I'm very impressed with the Ghost Glide Cyclones. I kept hearing so much buzz about these skates, and I can definitely see why, as they're a fantastic skate, as their performance is great across the board on all pad types aside from very soft ones. Durability and reusability is fantastic, but they have one critical downside, and that is their pricing. Here in Canada, one set of the Cyclone skates retails for 20 Canadian dollars, which is a fairly reasonable price when you consider import fees and all that stuff. But when you compare that price to X-Ray Pad's Obsidian skates, which retail for only 14 Canadian dollars, it's difficult to recommend paying more for what is essentially the same skate. Yes, there are some small differences between the two skates, but there isn't enough of a differentiation between the two skates for me to justify paying more for the Cyclones. The same goes when you compare the Cyclones to the Obsidian Air skates, as they retail for 17 Canadian dollars, but they include the added layer of SMPF, so they're pretty much silent on glass while having the same-ish performance profile as the regular Obsidian Dots did to the Cyclones. I definitely think Ghost Glide should be reevaluating their pricing. If they were priced around 15 to 16 Canadian dollars, I could definitely justify spending the extra dollar or two to get the Cyclones over other skate types. But currently, while I think they are a fantastic skate, the Cyclones are just too expensive compared to the competition for me to justify getting. But as I mentioned earlier, the Cyclones isn't Ghost Glide's only skate type, as they also have the 66 and Vortex dots, which unlike the Cyclones, are unlike anything I have ever tested when it comes to a skate. So I'm hoping those skates justify their higher pricing, but we'll talk more about that when I review those skates. But if you'd like to learn more about the Ghost Glide Cyclones, I will have a couple product links down in the video description for you to check out if you're interested. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much again to Potent Gaming for sending over the Ghost Glide Cyclones for review. I greatly appreciate that. Big thank you to our channel members, Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, Lunaris, Mark World, and everyone else. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, you can become a member here for only 2 Canadian dollars a month. That is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, Mech Keys, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money off your orders. Thanks again for watching my review of the Ghost Glide Cyclones, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.